Okay, we're going to continue on with these slides. We're going to talk about the triangular trade. So, the triangular trade was a trading network lasting from the 1600s to the 1800s that carried goods and enslaved people from Europe to the Americas and Africa. So there were 16 forts that served as trading posts on the West African coast. So you see them here on this map. And European traders would wait at these forts for slaves, and African traders transported slaves from the interior of Africa. Africans found themselves sold and traded more than once, often in slave markets, and anyone, from poor to royalty, could be abducted during inter-African raids to secure slaves for trade. So, this was very devastating for African life. Across the board, culture and traditions were torn apart, families were abducted, and after guns were introduced, slave raids and wars escalated. So there was a marked increase in violence. So the triangular trade, the first leg of the trip, slave traders delivered goods from European ports to West African ones. And then in the middle leg of the trip, ship captains unloaded empty holds of goods and reloaded with slaves. And then finally the slaves were transported to the Americas and the Caribbean. So the journey would take about 60 to 90 days to 4 months. And in total, about 54,000 voyages were made to buy and sell slaves. So that's quite a number. So here's the process. After kidnapping potential slaves, merchants forced them to march to European coastal forts, which sometimes was as long or as far as 1,000 miles. They were shackled, underfed, and about 50% survived. So those who were too sick or weary to keep up were killed or left to die. And those who reached the coastal forts were put into underground dungeons where they would stay, sometimes for as long as a year, until they were boarded on the ships. And just as horrifying as these marches were, was the Middle Passage, which came after it. So the Middle Passage is the name for voyages that brought enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to North America and the West Indies. Once purchased, Africans were packed below the decks of slave ships, and hundreds of men, children, women were crammed into a single vessel. And they became a sort of floating coffin, because often up to half the Africans on board died from disease or brutal mistreatment. So you see the march in this image below, in that intra-African march to the coastal ports. And then here you see how tightly everybody was packed in. You could see that the conditions were so inhumane that that's not even an adequate word to describe how human beings were treated. So this also gives an overview. And they're packed for profit. So some of the conditions and statistics. We know that they were herded and packed like cattle. There was unbearable heat and unbreathable air. People were usually chained in pairs, shackled, wrist to wrist, or ankle to ankle. People were crowded in their own waste. So disease spread like wildfire. And the small crew had the job of trying to wrangle, a large group of people, so they were often very cruel as a method to sustain control, using muzzles and whippings. Well, the journey lasted 3 to 6 weeks, but often longer, and 1 to 2 million people died crossing. And at dock, families were broken at auctions. So just families weren't kept together. So adolescent males were very prized and the most expensive for their work abilities and strength, and women were prized because they can reproduce and add to the master's wealth. Resistance. People definitely tried to resist. So while ships were still close to the shore, insurrections of desperate slaves sometimes broke out. Many went mad in these barbaric conditions. I know I would. Others just chose to jump to their watery deaths rather than endure. So there were different things that happened. It was very hard for an insurrection to be successful. So once the slaves were in the New World or in the colonies, they still tried to resist, and it was just very difficult. Usually it was through things like non-cooperation or petty theft and sabotage and countless acts of insubordination. And sometimes they would resort to more open or violent means of resistance, like poisoning of animals and owners, self-mutilation and suicide, or just go MIA, missing, regardless of the punishment. And about 10% of all of the enslaved took action, which sometimes involved moving temporarily to another location. But it was just very hard to be successful. One, you were easily located by color. So back when there were indentured servants, they could more easily hide because they would be the same nationality or color as the people who were had them indentured. So it was easier for them to just take off. In this case, that wasn't so true at the time. Now, their African resistance also occurred. So one that is in your book is the Congo ruler Alfonso I. And he wrote a letter to the King of Portugal in 1526 to demand an end to the illegal depopulation of his kingdom. And other rulers also took a stand. And some really tried to limit and suppress the slave trade. Many banned the slave trade and even tried to attack European forts on the coast. So one group called the Futa Toro were located in West Africa and several Muslim states in West Africa along the Senegal River basin. And they totally opposed the trafficking of humans, and the Almami and Futa Toro forbade transporting slaves through that region for sale abroad. Now the sea captains and local chiefs protested and called for the Almami to repeal the law, and he refused and sent back the presents given to him by the sea captain in an attempt to bribe him. And his victory was short-lived. The inland slave traders simply worked out a new route to the coast. So it was really hard to gain traction against this atrocious human travesty. So other methods of resistance is flight. Some were keeping your own cultural traditions alive no matter where you were displaced. Some turned to religion. Others destroyed farm equipment or attacked the slaveholder's family. Some, and this part was in Africa, moved villages to inaccessible areas. And then an interesting thing that happened in the Caribbean, African slave communities, they would actually locate their communities in a secret area. So there were secret communities of fugitive slaves. And this was first established in 16th century by Africans enslaved by the Spanish in the Caribbean. And some joined the Native Americans of that area. So they would coexist in maroon communities. slavery in the colonies, most slaves worked in plantations, mines, towns, and the countryside. Then women would provide the domestic duties as cooks or servants. And of course, there was a constant fear of slave rebellion. Many slave owners did not teach their slaves to read. So I'm sure that many of you could imagine why. Reading is power. And it's interesting because the church services usually only read from the New Testament about the suffering of Christ and avoided the Old Testament about Moses and the exodus of slaves. So that was definitely purposeful. And there was stiff punishments for even the most minor of offenses to keep the enslaved under control. So the effects of the slave trade, this is a very short list because in reality there's cultural devastation as well, but the Atlantic slave trade continued for about 400 years with 15 to 20 million Africans shipped to Americas, and the labor of African slaves helped build the economies of the American colonies. So that's, not a great legacy there. The African diaspora, dispersal of people of African descent, was also impactful. So as African tribes and groups became depopulated, and here is a pretty good map to look at that shows the slave trade route and also the exchange of goods as well, what was being grown in each area, the cash crops that they needed the laborers for. So that's about it for now. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you.